All right, so we are now talking about realism and desire in the bourgeois novel of the 19th century and really looking at Balzac, but a number of other, inevitably, a number of other authors are going to enter into the picture here. And we then move to a very interesting conversation in the next chapter on a figure named George Gissing, who is a realist in his own right, coming out of a kind of Charles Dickensonian style depiction of the poor and the underclass and the people and the sort of undesirable. And so we get into the ideology of the portrayal of poverty. Um, Obviously, Lukatch's treatment of Balzac in his studies on European realism and his theory of the novel informs quite a lot of what Jameson is doing here. But as we already have examined, this is all funneled through this post-structuralist Lacanian and Althusserian lens. And here, given that the second term of the chapter is desire, it is Lacan's framework that is doing the most work. And what we find is the kind of notion, right, that Balzac, in fact, um, unlike what Lukács wants to claim, in a very optimistic way, uh, you see Lukács's claim was that uh, Balzac, even though his fantasy, his sort of wish fulfillment, is for the destruction of the progress of the Jacobin movement out of the French Revolution, and really in the side of a kind of royalist, um, restorationist position where the Ancien regime would re-attain its power, its vitality in society. Um, Balzac is a novelist who creates these stories um, that are highly elaborate, often highly comedic, full of characters who have spice and insane originality in their own right. But ultimately, what ends up occurring is that the genius of Balzac, what makes him different than like Eugene Sue or a lot of these kind of serial romance writers of the time, or even Dumas, like the Count of Monte Cristo, is the fact that there is a profound social commentary going on with Balzac. In other words, he uses omniscient narrator to insert a sort of political voice that is, in some senses, unambiguously intervening into the social and political fabric of the societies that he's portraying. Um, the two books by Balzac that are considered is The Black Sheep and The Peasants. Lukács characterizes the peasants as a deeply political but yet contradictorily political text, insofar as Balzac will refer to the peasants as uh, a million Robespierres that are hungry for success on the market, right? And so a lot of the tragedy of the drama of Balzacian novels is founded upon this like brute materialist yearning of each character that ends in tragedy due to the contradictory placement of their class and the inequality of the class system itself. So Balzac is a figure of a thinker who reveals the decadence, on the one hand, of the fact that what is most vital in society, the energetics of society, is expressed through criminals. And we saw in Adorno's short piece called Reading Balzac, you'll see that you get in this time period, and of course, when we get to George Gissing, this is much more evident. Um, the criminal becomes the hero in a certain way because of the realities that the decadent society cannot achieve class mobility. It's foreclosed. Revolutionary consciousness of a class is foreclosed. And what you get are these kind of in-between characters who, like with Gissing, one of Gissing's main motifs, and he even wrote a book, I think, called The Unclass or D-Class, which has a resonance to the Maoist notion of the déclassé, or even has a resonance to that figure that we despised in French theory of the déclassé, bourgeois who proletarianizes themselves in the great service of the socialist cause, right? Well, in this case, the unclassed are kind of defined by people who may have these kind of momentary experiences where they get access to um, a pot of money or an inheritance, or they have kind of like an outlier relative who's wealthy. And this then becomes the catalyst for the complete transformation of their life. But then the novel ends in a tragic way whereby no true fulfillment, no true event, nothing substantial comes from this experience. So they end in a stalemate. And that stalemate is a reflection of the stalemate of the organic social metabolic system itself at the time, right? And the kind of the rivalries of class. The rivalries of class are expressed all over the place. Now, the question is, how does Balzac's desire as an author, which is very much driven by this Sartrean project, which Jameson doesn't mention, surprisingly, of course, on the Flaubert biography. Now, Jean-Paul Sartre sort of innovated. If you have read his biographies, you'll know this. Jean Genet, most famously Jean Genet, Sartre wrote a biography of this literary leftist figure, sort of real interesting savant figure whose life just had to be turned into a biography because he grew up as a pauper, he grew up imprisoned, and he went on to become kind of this great literary figure in France. But the profundity by which Jean-Paul Sartre interrogates Jean Genet's life was so profound that Genet said he couldn't write for, I think, something like 2 years after he read this biography about himself that Sartre had wrote. So, as I've mentioned on prior shows, this notion of existentialist biography is quite powerful and quite profound, but it's very, very different than the psychoanalytic view that Jameson adopts. So Jameson is not centering a conception of desire in a Sartrean mode. He's centering desire in a Lacanian modality, but he's also doing so, I would say, in a Freudian mode. Now, I just got done writing an essay on this, and so if you're not familiar, I think you might want to read it. It's quite short, but it's Freud's seminal text on aesthetics, and it's basically called The Creative Writer and Daydreaming is the title. It's only about 3 or 4 pages. Highly recommend that you read it. What he argues is that the novelist, he's focusing particularly on novelists, on the one hand, are themselves touched by neurosis of some sort, but what accounts for their genius is the ease by which they re-inhabit a state of wish fulfillment, which mimics the daydream. And here the daydream, and it's kind of interesting because a lot of, I think, subsequent Bohemian artists would be influenced by this, references this kind of infinite space of play of the child, right? So the artist, and you can even think of these sort of insight meditation notions of David Lynch, the great film auteur, where he's always talking about how creativity is like entering into this like unimpeded space of like allowing for ideas to come to you, and which is why insight meditation is so important to him. I would contend that Freud's theory of creativity is something kind of close to Lynch's idea, right? But the notion here, though, is that it kind of ends up into this collective daydream in which we have a connection to social field, to sociality, to something shared. And therefore, what you get is a very interesting move from the individual libidinal, familial, sort of neurotic nexus into the capacity for a kind of universalization of one's own symptom that then becomes the source of the object of that which is communicated, right? And so immediately we find that the theory of the Freudian novelist is connected to a particular theory of neurosis in which, and Rosichner is very good at reminding us that Freud always begins from the presupposition, not, I think this is somewhat of a debate, that the neurotic subject is not the normative subject. In fact, Freud insists that there's a strong distinction. And in fact, the neurotic subject is sort of like associated with an exceptional figure, right? Um, in fact, the neurotic subject is associated with the scientist and with the artist. They both or all three are examples of a contestation of the reality principle itself. That's the key point, because the daydream is the centrifugal origin of creativity because it is a confrontation with the reality principle. And that's what gives it also a kind of revolutionary valence as we examine it vis-a-vis realism. Okay. So we can examine the biography of Balzac and recognize that, in fact, it's no surprise that even though he has these elaborate character systems that he develops um, in his works, from the bureaucrats to the black sheep to the peasants to the human comedy and so on, uh, Jameson basically says it's plausible for us to sort of channel all of that back into the kind of idiosyncrasies of his familial desires. And then it becomes more complex because the various movements of elision, of denouement, of this kind of idea of not allowing the completion of the story to have a utopian ending, itself becomes a reflection not necessarily reducible to Balzac's own reactionary position, but rather is a reflection about a tragic claim on society as such, right? So it becomes this question of how we combine the imaginary to what Jameson calls a symbolic text. This is very important. This distinction between imaginary and symbolic. And I'm going to portray this to you in a moment with a sort of diagram that I created. But one of the helpful things that he says, right, is that it's actually quite rare in literature, popular literature, to actually discover texts which elevate to a symbolic status. In other words, most art kind of, and most kind of quality art, let's say, like an artist that could do it for a career, or even you think of like a ghostwriter may not be capable of producing a symbolic enactment of a text in which they have sublimated, in a certain sense, this imaginary register to something that has a kind of palpable or universal commentary that is then sort of critical. You know, this point that Jameson made in the last couple of chapters we've been reading, that literary criticism um, can actually produce these moments of rupture in which the object becomes what he calls cultural revolution. No, of course, it would be at that level that the author is touching the symbolic. They're touching something like a shared source of meaning with a readership. But he says a lot of novelists, especially the serial, and you guys know what a serial is, right? It was actually quite interesting. You know, if you get these books by these romantic writers, they're like thousands of pages. But when the French or Parisian public was exposed to them at the time, they were released in the same way that a series would be on Netflix today. So we read them as composites like this, but the public was reading them in like increments, right? Okay. And that's very interesting because characters become a literal expression of a typological class as such, right? And this is something that is happening whether the author is sort of aware of it or not. And so, anyways, let me actually share what I think hopefully will be quite helpful. Okay. Now, the notion of ideology is of extreme importance here because in this conception, it's where the Althusserian idea of ideology as an imaginary representation of real social conditions, which is how he defines it in Lenin philosophy, is thought. Okay. And it is in this mode whereby we see a sort of break between the Althusserian and the Lukatchian dichotomy in philosophy. So the big philosophical contrast that's sort of going on. And at a certain point in the chapter on realism and desire, Jameson says straight out that Lukatch is wrong regarding his overall reading of Balzac, which is that history, according to Balzac, which is an idea he originally got from Engels, is in fact representable in Balzac's novels. Jameson claims, in fact, that it's not. And in fact, what you get are a kind of series of seams, right? That are common seams. And here's another way to understand this idea that most novelists remain caught within an ideological axiomatic. It's because this notion that we talked about last time in some great depth with Connor, of the idea of the ideology. Most authors are performing a type of non-revolutionary operation on the ideology. This is best expressed in Gissing and in Charles Dickens. And I was having an interview today with Alan Wald, who I'm very excited to share it with you guys. In fact, it's on his new book called Bohemian Bolsheviks. And it's basically a study of realism in 20th century American literature. And one of the things he said is that there's a profound debate about the various levels of what qualifies as realism versus naturalism, but what qualifies as democratic realism versus socialist realism versus proletarian realism, right? And so, for example, uh, in a figure like George Gissing, what we find is a series of kind of, on the one hand, um, representations of the impossibility of social freedom, right? So there's not at the end of his works some type of utopian vision in which the characters are capable of either revolutionizing the class system or truly achieving their desire. So desire is basically blocked, by history in a certain way. But the way that this functions, of course, is that it falls back on sort of like a common ideological trope, which is what Jameson calls the ideology. And the common trope for Gissing, of course, is this notion of charity or philanthropy. And I was reviewing Gissing's work, and I haven't read all of his work. I think I had heard about him years ago. I'm actually very intrigued to read him now, given that it's all class themed. One of the things that Jameson says is that the ideology that he works with the most is, on the one hand, renunciation, which is he associates with Charles Dickens. What is that? The basic notion of renunciation is, in fact, this kind of Puritan bourgeois idea, very Victorian, in which the realization of one's stunted desire, of either sort of it like being oppressively removed from your realm of possibility. The question is, how does the subject or the character actually come to accept their fate? So ultimately, it's a series of novels regarding the inevitability of history overwhelming fate, the fate of the characters, such that no change is possible, right? This is why I have here this notion of denouement, which basically refers to this moment in the novel in which a decisive action, which could change the scales, ends on the side of a reaffirmation of status quo, right? On the other hand, it also reinforces, from the standpoint of the imaginary, this notion of a kind of ideological closure. So, in other words, ideological closure is also present in Balzac's works, according to Jameson, in the sense that what he says is that Balzac is a superior writer precisely for Marxism, because Balzac gives us access to something like the social totality. On the one hand, he de-individualizes his characters; they become representations of classes, and he shows almost like their organic connectivity to each other. But he forecloses what Jameson earlier referred to as libidinal transfiguration. So the possibility of social freedom isn't really of interest to Balzac, because why? Because what does Balzac associate social freedom with? He associates it with the left. But the left had been absorbed um, by the bourgeoisie, by the merchant class. And so they are the sort of ones responsible for the total devitalization of of energy, of the dispensation of energy, of desire itself. And so you see immediately why Marxists are attracted to Balzac, because he has this sort of, on the one hand, hatred of money. He has a sort of hatred of the market and its superficiality, of its foreclosing of social freedom. On the other hand, he has this glorious way of actually showing the interrelationships of class conflict, even though his conclusions result in the impossibility of social freedom. Okay. Now, I think this notion of the political unconscious emerges at this point, whereby it becomes kind of like um, the impossibility for, and he says this at the end of Realism and Desire chapter, for Balzac himself, right? Because if we have this Freudian conception of the form of the artist as caught within a kind of neurotic structure, a wish fulfillment, an individual libidinal situation, which itself is not resolvable, there's like no true catharsis possible. Well, that also informs the catharsis of society itself, right? So, on the one hand, it is blocked at this level. Although, on the other hand, I feel that there is like a whole other array of realist literature that doesn't get studied as much, partially because this is like a post-Soviet phenomenon where proletarian realism became the state genre that was promoted. And one of the things I was talking with Alan Wald about today is the repression that that created, because what it led to was a total incoherence regarding the actual biography of a novelist and their depiction of social reality. And so the best example of that is this American um, proletarian writer named Agnes Smedley, who portrays her childhood as being victim of the Great Ludlow strike. And she portrays her father as basically this like super proletarian figure who is a great victim of the police repression at this famous miners' strike. And then we look at Agnes's biography, and in fact, her father was a cop who persecuted the workers, and they lived within the whatever, like the corporate city of the workers, the miners. Um, so, but that goes disavowed, and it goes disavowed because she had a commitment to proletarian realism. So we can assess the ethics of that for whatever, but if you read the book I'm talking about called Daughter of Earth, you'll see that at the end, what you find is a libidinal transfiguration. The possibility of social freedom is opened. A movement of class position is open. Class consciousness occurs, right? There is enacted the possibility of another way of organization after. So it ends in a kind of utopian valence, right? That's not the basis by which Balzac's or Gissing's or many of these bourgeois novelists are going to end, right? They're going to be up on the upper end here of impossibility of social freedom. But Jameson is saying, I think in both cases, you still have the political unconscious emerge at that moment in which you have almost like the crossing of the imaginary and the real, right? And so ultimately, it's kind of a story, I would say, of sort of like a frustrated impossibility of history. Again, Lukatch is dancing very carefully, because I was recently reading in preparation for another interview I'm doing on Lukatch. I was recently reading his work on realism. And it's very interesting to think about the way that he speaks of Balzac because of the censorship that he's having to deal with in the very specific Soviet milieu, because they were not confident whether Balzac should be allowed to be read, precisely because of his political commitments to basically reaction to aristocracy, ancien regime, right? And so Lukács is constantly trying to make the claim, no, in fact, this is a world historical figure who has his pulse on something like a teleological development of history, right? Um, so anyways, that something for us to think about. Um, We can dig into further, if you all wish, the three levels of Balzac's novel, The Old Maid and The Black Sheep. Um, Happy to, if Conrad wishes to do that, we're more than welcome to. Um, he says something interesting on 179, quote, "The symbolic relaxes the imaginary, so dreams of privilege console the imagination, which is tormented by unresolvable contradictions." Right? The phantasm is this super important idea that I didn't articulate, but the phantasm you could understand as the kind of point, the origin point of the wish fulfillment desire of the writer as such. And so in a way, um, it's that sticky point that the writer never is capable of fully shrugging off. It's like their own individual excess, which marks and colors everything, which would sort of already point to the imminent contradiction or difficulty of something like proletarian realism. And I was actually surprised to learn um, that a lot of socialist realists preferred socialist realism precisely because bourgeois society does not present class relations or the working class experience in quote unquote um, in this neat packaged transitive way. Right? Social suffering does not exhibit itself this way. But as we examine vis-a-vis Gissing's notion of ressentiment, which I think Conrad will talk about further, what I find very interesting here is that the bourgeois novelist, in this case Gissing, constructs narratives in which resentment, ordinary resentment, must be contained. And now here you'll see my note here of what we call containment strategies, right? Where did I put containment strategies? I thought that I put it in here somewhere. Yeah. This is portrayed through the decision of the author, right, to direct the plot in the direction in which social relations are basically foreclosed from a revolutionary possibility. And that is through this idea of like the real of, and here it's kind of unclear if like whether the ideology, say, of philanthropy, because Thomas Hardy or even Horatio Alger are very comparable to Gissing because they're kind of like Dickensian authors who are portraying the working class, but they're not capable of actually seeing the working class as a class. In fact, they prefer to portray a type of nostalgic individualism whereby what gets sort of elided is the fact that you could understand these individuals as in a class in a certain way. And I guess this notion of is very, very, very much expressed in a book that I know Matilda is familiar with called The Mysteries of Paris by Eugene Sue, where it's basically this idea, and this is mentioned a lot by Jameson as well, where kind of like Balzac, the heroes become the underground, the plebs, the lumpenproletariat, the kind of those outside of wage work. And this serial became extremely popular precisely for the same reason that like Foucault talks about in Madness and Civilization, whereby like the Ship of Fools became very popular in Europe. I don't know if you remember that part in Madness and Civilization, whereby it's kind of like the exoticism of the other. It portrays what bourgeois individualism cannot achieve. So you see the contradiction there, which is bourgeois individualism at a class standpoint cannot achieve its promise, which is like this high singular unique individualism, right? Because of the contradictions of the class system itself. But the lumpenproletariat in these novels can, in a certain way. I think that's one way to understand Gissing. But again, I think Jameson's most interesting point is that what ultimately resentment is sort of avoided, or like the true confrontation of the undergirding class conflict is rerouted. And that again would be like this notion of containment strategy, right? It's like a foreclosing of the real, right? Whereas what I'd like to see more examples of would be sort of like libidinal transfiguration, in which you have a collective liberation that is portrayed and represented in the novel. Um, so I think I'll stop there. There's a lot more to say, but I'll turn it over to Conrad. Thank you guys for listening.
Thank you, Daniel. I appreciated that. My comments will probably touch as well because we went to page we went further, did we not? We went to go to page 218. Is that not correct?
We did go further, but we
Yeah.
also hadn't
Okay.
talked about. So I didn't get to romance and reification, but in part because, like, I don't know, I was gonna let you do that, but also like we just there's a lot that we needed to discuss from before that we haven't, because Connor's presentation was very much on like this. I don't know if you were there. Were you there?
I wasn't there last week, no.
Yeah, it was like a Gramscian square exercise on
Okay.
Tarantino. It was actually great fun.
Okay.
But I wanted to sort of review these two chapters.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, no, I won't add too much because I don't want to hold things up and I think that, Daniel's done a good job providing some summary. And I don't necessarily think that, for the sort of broadly theoretical purpose that we've gathered here for, that it's useful to run through at a presentation level, the nuances of every single allegorical representation within these texts. Um, but I do think there's a few things here that are interesting to know. I mean, I found it quite interesting because, one thing Daniel says here is that, one of the ways that within traditional positive appreciations of realism, from a Marxian standpoint, one of the things that is often said about Balzac is that, well, voila, right? Like there is a realistic form of representation. Of course, it's also mingled with a kind of ideological standpoint relevant to his social class, but that ultimately the richness of the realistic representation overwhelms, in a certain sense, his sort of bourgeois aristocratic impulse, right? And I thought it was interesting because Jameson's, as Tut does allude to here, um, Jameson's reading is, while echoing a lot of these notions, is slightly different. And that has precisely to do with the way that desire appears within the work, right? And he relates Balzac, if we go earlier, not this reading, but the one before it, he relates Balzac to a kind of shift, within the composition of novels in general, when, in terms of individualization or psychologization, in which the driving of the plot becomes contingent upon desire, right? And then there's this larger kind of economy of energetics, right? That we find within Balzac as well. I think that, and we see this like when he's talking about, the different novels here, The Old Maid, Black Sheep, right? And, particularly the way that Balzac uses the theme of energetics to represent the sort of competition between the classes, right? So if you look at something like The Old Maid, if we look at the competition between the various suitors, and in a sense, the portrayal of this sort of combination of um, Jacobinism and personal monarchy that characterized Napoleon as a sort of dead end in the way that that allegory functions. It also functions at the level of precisely desire, right? And I mean, very, very clearly so, right? When we're talking about, a story that takes impotence as such a central motif, right? And it's dealing with a choice between possible marital partners. So I think that all of this is to say that I think that, because like one of the things that Jameson is doing with psychoanalysis, right, is that Jameson, while he believes in a sense in the validity of psychoanalysis, right, he also feels a compulsion to situate it with respect to history, right? So what are the particular set of historical conditions that, began that allowed us not only to postulate the primacy of the nuclear family in this way, but also to perceive the nuclear family as a limit, right, to the development of the individual. Because it's not just about, the nuclear family, it's also about, the unfettering, right, of the limitations of that model, in certain ways. So all of this is just to say that I think that when he examines, in addition to what I take to be not like fairly standard analyses, of which are sometimes biographical in nature, as with the mother that never sufficiently appreciated Balzac, right? Right, that then appears in the Black Sheep, or whether they're sort of fairly regular kind of political analyses. I think maybe what's most distinct about the way that Jameson analyzes Balzac is the way that he sees, in some respects, a deeper ideological matrix at work within his writings than is sometimes associated with them, which again, going back to desire, psychoanalysis, energetics, the family, and so on. I think that maybe that's like the thing to take away when it comes to that. Now it's interesting here when we move to Gissing. Gissing? I don't know.
I think so. Yeah,
Interesting,
he's British.
Um,
It's Gissing. I've heard
oh,
it
Gissing.
pronounced multiple times as Gissing.
Gissing. Okay. Yeah. Well, this is I hope that this is what everybody signed up to as well, is to have a bunch of people who aren't formally trained in literature talking about literature. So you guys are gonna have to bear with us on this. You get a bunch of very theoreticist takes on literature, but maybe that's compatible with Jameson somehow. But no, when it comes to Gissing, I think it's interesting because we know traditionally within commentaries on the importance of realism, Marxist appreciations. Uh, Balzac obviously has a quite a privileged role, right? And there is a kind of textual originalism to this, right? Because we have, comments from Marx and Engels themselves, right? That make positive remarks about, the social scope, right, or analysis afforded, by the literary realism of that period. Now, Gissing, of course, is realism, but it's also, what Jameson terms high realism, right? And then it will become a little bit more complex on that basis. But what I found interesting is that uh, in some ways, Jameson is more sympathetic. I don't want to like make this into a good bad thing because he's very dialectical, but in some ways, Jameson is more sympathetic to Gissing than to Balzac. In some ways, of course, they both have strategies of containment. They both have issues and so forth. But I think that the reason, in a sense, this is at one point he makes this basic comment. He says again, with Balzac, we find this tremendous um, ideological economy of desire and energetics and so on and so forth. But he basically says that in Gissing, what's interesting is um, that becomes precisely empirical, right? So the way that he portrays characters, right? He describes it as a laboratory, right? So we could take the example of Demos, right? When you have the proletarian activist who inherits the factory, right? Actually, because there's a I think part of the will is ripped off or it's like misconstrued, right? And then turns out to be spectacularly unfit for this task, right? Um, so, again, we're I think there's an implicit historically in the receptions of Balzac, I think there's an implicit tendency to associate realism, as it were, of the Balzacian type with empiricism. But Jameson here is slightly different, right? Because I feel like he attributes a greater empiricism to Gissing than to Balzac. But we have to be careful, right? Because Jameson, let us remember, he doesn't let anyone off the hook, right? And history is an absent cause, right? So what that means in this case is that for his characters, right? To these sort of experimental changes in social conditions, and we're going to thereby see how they perform, if you will. This is not the same as science, right? Because the deck is loaded. And this is where he gets into the ideologum, pardon me, of Ressentiment.
Is that how you
right?
pronounce it?
Uh,
Ideologum?
uh, Ideologum. I guess so. Like, has
I call
anyone
it
ever said that word to you?
ideologeme, but that's
Ideologeme. Okay, you have like a French.
I think that's correct, but I could be wrong. I will say this. I think that this notion, Jameson, I'm not sure how much he used it after the political unconscious. It may be one of those terms that he abandons, but somebody might want to verify that.
Well, I think so. I think it's interesting because in a way, like, and actually, some of the comments on I reposted one in Capital Comrades, the Facebook group I co-administrate with Daniel, which if people here aren't part of, I know some people are, of course, Matthew, for example, but if people aren't part of, they should join. A little plug there. But no, but it's interesting because this relates to Ressentiment, right? And there's a kind of double operation at work that we find throughout Gissing's tags. And one of them is this injunction, which is quite characteristic of, the sort of bourgeois literature of the time, which is this idea that, if you change your social station, you're going to be punished, right? So we see this when he talks about, the uh, uh, proletarian young woman who wants to advance her social station by becoming an actress, right? And then she has acid hurled in her face by another jealous actress. And like, so what's interesting about this, right? And it's interesting to think about the metaphor of the laboratory because all of this is in a sense so spectacularly implausible and melodramatic, right? But the laboratory, as it will, having been set up by Gissing, there has to be these sort of bizarre intervening conditions, right, that are going to be invoked in order to produce the sought for result, right, which is the message that you will never succeed, right, by virtue of changing your social station. And yet, and yet, there are other elements to Gissing, right, which I think Jameson is highly appreciative of, right? On one hand, I think in a very rudimentary sense, there is, in spite of, like, even if we take away, or even if we acknowledge the implausibility of these things, right? Like the acid being hurled in the face. And of course it's all over, right? Same wise with the idea of cultivating this proletarian young woman to be a philanthropist, right? Which is a destiny that, she ultimately isn't going to subscribe to and probably isn't fit for. Um, you know, we have to acknowledge that these are kind of overweening editorial impositions, or overweening authorial impositions, if you will, of something which is real, right? Again, let us remember history cannot be directly represented, which is the practical situation of class and mobility, within capitalism. And though Jameson does not describe it, I do think it's interesting that we're also witnessing a social shift, right, from Balzac to Gissing, whereas in Balzac, it's still the building up of capitalism, right? When the French Revolution happened, at the early part of the French Revolution, you have 610 representatives who come to negotiate the future of France. Only 90 of those were in commerce, and only maybe 10 of those were involved in industrial production, right? So that should give you an idea of how totally marginal what we might think of as capitalism, right, was to the France of the French Revolution. So it's only really when you get into like the Belle Epoque and so on, the period after, we're really witnessing the construction of capitalism. But because of that construction, right, and the Belle Epoque itself was very unequal, don't get me wrong, but nevertheless, because of that construction and the primitive accumulation it entails, there's and to talk about how social mobility and inequality could persist side by side. I mean, a good example might be, let's say, the conditions of China in the 1978 2012 period, right? Because of course, on one hand, you see wide inequalities which are emerging, right? Because of, the way that, um, uh, some people are uh, uh, breaking out, right, of the socialist system. But that in of itself, right, is symptomatic of a certain kind of social mobility, which is opening up, right? So you can see kind of the coexistence of those terms. But I think in a way, he says one thing about, he talks about the angel of the hearth, right? The sort of ideology, is it? employed here, right? The kind of romanticization, right, of the woman, in the home who has this sort of nurturing impulse vis-a-vis society as a whole. And there's a kind of biting line there. And he says that for Gissing, the hearth has become more like a ghetto, right? So in a way, we see that, the dynamic, right, conditions of social mobility, which had been, acknowledged in some sense by Balzac. And obviously it's complex because there's a lot of demographics which were, marginalized and so on. But nevertheless, within Gissing, they become quite paralyzed, right? So even again, even if it's very melodramatic for this woman who aspires to be an actress to have acid thrown at her face, which arrests her social ascent, right? Obviously makes it impossible to be an actress. There is something there, the absent cause of history that's being represented on that level, right? But that's one side of it. But the other side of it, the other side of it is that in this sort of laboratory model, the other side of it is that while he has this, uh, idea that, okay, stay in your place, right? Which again is not just negative and moralistic, right? It's also reflecting certain conditions. The other side of this is that he's also very critical of bourgeois philanthropy. So I think not only in this sense can we understand there to be a recognition of the, calcification of capitalism, right? And the social immobility that creates. But also, I think there is an anticipation of the kind of deadlock, that's going to lead to some of the more, or already has led to, in some sense, I should check the dates of the books, but that's going to lead to the organization of like a powerful socialist movement and eventually, say, the Russian Revolution,
Mm,
right? Because, it's like in this society that is, in which not only is inequality, extremely vast, but also social mobility is paralyzed,
mm,
right? What you'll really need, is the intervention, right, of a non-bourgeois kind of organization, right, as the way to resolve this. And this is completely in the vein of what he's describing, right? He portrays, I think there's one of the books he's talking about. Yeah, it's Demos. That's what I was saying. So the again, activist who inherits the factory from his uncle, and ultimately this bid to create a kind of utopian industrial site is undermined by the fact that he has a kind of proletarian collaborator whose life is illuminated, by the kind of encouragement of reading and so forth, that the activist who inherits the factory is involved with. But then the guy who inherits the factory, he falls in love with the wife of his proletarian collaborator, right? And it's this decision that will end up discrediting him, right? Not only in the eyes of this witness to these events, who's so decisive, right, for the assessment of his subjectivity, but also obviously metaphorically and socially, in relation to this sort of uh, progressive class project as a whole, right? Because it's like, what else could it be ultimately, than the person who gets power, right? Harboring the desire to appropriate the wife, right, of the proletarian. Of course, there's another dimension to that too, because the wife is above the class station of the proletarian man she marries, right? So he does point this out, right? There's also a kind of blame upon the proletarian. What, you thought you could advance, right?
right.
Um, and I feel like actually Gissing would be very relevant in a certain sense for today, based on what Jameson is saying, and not
Yeah.
obviously being a Gissing scholar or even someone who's read a Gissing novel from beginning to end. But it sounds like, based on what Jameson's saying, the Gissing would be very relevant for the present. This sort of dual ressentiment. And I think you could actually see it very strongly if you look at something like the Donald Trump coalition, right? The MAGA coalition, right? Because on one hand, right, there's this kind of, elitism or classism, which is such a feature of it. But on the other hand, you have this tremendous anger, right, towards liberal politicians, right, within the Democratic Party, for example. Seemingly, I think in many cases, because of the sort of hypocrisy of their actions, right? Which you could subject to Marxist critique, of course, right? Like if you look at the way that they address problems of race in America, which I've discussed, but that tends to boil down to a kind of critique of a sort of attitudinal racism that doesn't plumb like the depths of our economic structure sufficiently, and thereby lends itself to, at most, like a kind of meek reformism, right? You could say much the same of, the absence of a meaningful economic critique of the family within liberal feminist discourses, right? So again, I think that, because this seems to be the thing that we have today, right? Like what we've kind of produced, um, is a right that sort of oscillates between, um, you know, um, again, like aggressive chauvinisms, right? And attacks on, I'm not going to say bourgeois philanthropy literally, but the limitations of, let's say, quote, bourgeois progressivism in a way that we could understand it, and I think in a certain sense sympathize with as Marxists. But the thing here is that like it's not being applied to actually generate a more transformative social vision, right? As much as with Gissing, it remains stuck,
Yeah.
right, within this kind of so
Although
and
it
excuse
does
me.
though it does bear I think it does I think you're right to say that it's like a expression of the petit bourgeois class position uniquely so, which is actually a claim of Max Scheler in his famous little essay called Ressentiment,
Yeah.
where he kind of deals with Nietzsche's concept of ressentiment and makes the very compelling claim that in fact this is a unique phenomenon to the petit bourgeois position because they're a contradictory class position, which is sort of um, has actually a foot in both class worldviews of the working class and the middle class, like they're kind of caught in between and so on. But listen to this though, because at the end, why does he call it authentic? Why is the chapter called Authentic Ressentiment? He said because all subject positions in Gissing's work um, revolt right, or sort of like fight against the commodification of desire. And therefore, like Ressentiment seems to situate a social phenomenon as an ideology which is not reducible just to the working class or underclass. You see my point? And I thought that that was why he said, how does he conclude the chapter? I absolutely love it. He says, actually, this is why it can be seen as a Sartrean form of bad faith,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
bad faith, if you've read Being and Nothingness, is not something which is sociologically um, sort of identifiable with like a particular class expression, you know? So in that regard, Gissing is almost fulfilling Nietzsche's prophecy about where ressentiment could go. Because, you know,
Mhm.
for Nietzsche, ressentiment is a complex issue. On the one hand, you have an ethical community building agenda in his more politically oriented late works like Antichrist, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, in which resentment is meant to be conquered through a kind of procedure of the overman, right? To sort of
Mhm.
subtract from sociality, right? On the other hand, you have from the birth of tragedy onward, an early Nietzsche and mid, you have the idea of ressentiment as a problem of Rousseauism, of the revolutionary tradition. In that sense, he's very close to Balzac, but if you read Nietzsche's views on Balzac, you'll notice that he far favors Stendhal. Why? Because he thinks that Balzac does not have the right physiology. Kind of goes back to
Mhm.
this weird familial neurotic complex that Balzac has regarding impotence and whatever neurotic complex he could smell that. But with Stendhal, he thinks that this is realism at its very finest, because even though Stendhal is lower class, Nietzsche valorizes him because he is triumphant. He actually escapes his class, if you read The Red and the Black, in a way. right? Remember, he's like, he has this beautiful fucking idea, which is like, I come to the city from like a poor boy, and my desire is to bring out the sword of leisure. So I'm going to
Mm.
fight society so I can have leisure. So I can have
Yeah.
leisure to become somebody singular, to become somebody great, to become the next Shakespeare. And he like rents these apartments and he just like reads Shakespeare all night, right? It's actually a very beautiful yearning. And so Nietzsche's like loves Stendhal for these reasons. And we don't see too much Stendhal in Political Unconscious, but nonetheless, okay, so for Ressentiment, though, I felt like Jameson's making a pretty interesting point, which is actually at this point in time, like, late Gilded Age Victorian inequality, the division of labor was such that a fundamental rigidity had overwhelmed the class system. And Gissing is portraying this, right? Such that maybe you could say like utopia is not possible as socialists would envision it. And Gissing is kind of just sort of showing you why it's not, maybe. Sorry to interrupt, Conrad, but just wanted to throw that in.
Acting under a changed set of conditions, which are generating the preconditions for the presentation of this kind of narrative closure as well. So I think it's also important to represent the historical shift there. But yeah, very, very thank you for those comments. Very good. The last thing I'll say, and I'm not going to get into this as because I think we're going to do more Conrad in the next part, and I think maybe his treatment of Conrad here is the most famous. I don't have like a scientific study on that, but anecdotally, I want to say it's quite famous. And I think it's part of. I actually this is 1981, right? And so I think there's a few things that happen around that period that really conspire to elevate Conrad's repute within literary circles and society at large. So I think an important one, which maybe would be worth discussing also in terms of its relationship to accelerationist ideology, in the next session would be Apocalypse Now, right? As an example of strategies of containment as well. But yeah, with respect to Conrad, we see Jameson setting up certain oppositions. It's clear that the sea for him, he sees this as occupying a contradictory place within Conrad's work. Because on one hand, the sea is representative of a sort of imaginary retreat from the contradictions of reality. And yet, at the same time, the sea is also a place of, I think he calls it the workings of business, right? So it's so absolutely decisive
Mm.
to the process of colonial expansion and commerce that it opens up the horizon to, its own kind of social exploration. And I think the importance of the sea as a site of, quote, the workings of business would be obvious to anyone familiar with the history of Shanghai, where I live, right? Because this was originally a treaty port, right? That was opened up by the British after the Opium War, right? To give them a pit, a base from which they could kind of deal drugs throughout China, right? Until China would later sort of conquer its own sovereignty and through a complex set of conditions I won't get into, including the invasion by Japan. But it's just one example, right? And let us remember as well that I think the British have defeated or all but 15 countries militarily, in the world at some point in history. So there's just it's all I think it's quite hard for us to fathom today, the sheer breadth of the British colonial empire, and the amount of global activities that were functioning within the context of one kind of sovereignty in that way, right? So because there's nothing really quite analogous to that today, right? Of course, we have, de facto American globalization, right? But this is very different in nature, right? So, but he sees other tensions within Conrad which are related to this, right? So one of them has to do with, high modern or kind of modernism, right? Or high literature as an expressive form, and popular literature, right? So this is something he refers to in Lord Jim. Of course, we know that, or we will discover that in Lord Jim, the main character Jim, he sets out with these aspirations, of kind of seafaring and quite romantic in nature. And they're quickly kind of spoiled when he's on a boat that is transporting, I believe, a number of Muslims to Mecca for a pilgrimage. And he's told they think it's going to sink. And so several people, including the protagonist, they attempt to get out of the boat, but then it doesn't sink. And then they're later basically severely reprimanded for cowardice, right? So that's kind of how his career starts out. But then he subsequently relocates to Patasan, where he becomes a kind of colonial factor, dealing with trade there, and earns the respect of the locals. Um, but this also comes to naught because of abortive efforts to protect them from pirates, I believe. And in the end, the protagonist is actually, after having um, engaged in a conflict in which an important member of the community died, in this colonial area, he goes to take direct responsibility for this to the father of the person who died, and the father, in a fit of rage, I believe, shoots him and kills him there. So, in a sense, it's about this failed moral trajectory, right? Where he wants to redeem himself, right? For the earlier act, and this fails. And by the way, I don't know if Jameson discusses this, but I think that he does certainly discuss the colonial context, but I think it wouldn't be a far reach to say that what Jameson's really talking about here, or sorry, what Conrad's also talking about here in Lord Jim is the failure of the colonial project itself. Right. So, there's this because you had these before you had national emancipation emerging as a broad goal, you had these repeated attempts to kind of reform colonialism, right? But ultimately the novel is going to come to a kind of second bad end, right? That seems to affirm, in a sense, the unsalvageability, right? But I thought it was very interesting. So he sees this as being based on a split, and he talks about the boat and the early parts of it is almost being like, a kind of proto-postmodern auto writing or something, right? Very groundbreaking in a way. And then the second part of the book he's in Padosan he sees as being more reminiscent of a kind of popular literature. Um, but I think that, this is also tied into another contradiction, which is the heart of modernism itself, right? So if we read someone like Ezra Pound, right, talking about literary criticism, um, one thing that he'll say, he makes very clear, is that on one hand, there's this eschewal of uh, popular culture and commercialization, right? Which is the kind of elitist dimension, right, of modernism, which is ultimately going to go in the direction also of a kind of fascist politics for some people, including Pound, who later became a radio lecturer from Mussolini. Um, but on the other hand, there's a sense in which they know that modernism is responding to it. So he talks about, the importance he assigned to imagery within poetry as being analogous, and the need for the shift as being analogous to the way that visual images are increasingly being experienced in a mediotic way, right? We have cinema, of course, emerging around 1900, right, conjointly in the United States and France, right? So in a way, modernism is opposing itself to what it sees as the kind of vulgarization, which is associable with popular culture. But in the same hand, it's having to borrow, right, from some of those same resources. So I think this is analogous to the shift to the opposition we're seeing between high literature and popular literature that's emerging within Conrad's work. And I think it was also very interesting because at one point he says that the function of modernism in a way is to prepare reality for its commodification, right? Through the act of aestheticization. He relates this to um, you know, the whole strategy of containment, which is apparent within Conrad, in which I think he says at one point, he sets up let me just double check. He sets up a binary at one point between what he calls, uh, yeah, he refers to Conrad as existential metaphysics and Ressentiment as being, you know, And it's precisely the immersion in these, right? Which is going to allow a strategy of containment that's going to foreclose certain aspects of the social reality. Um, but anyway, but he sees this as being linked to the role, the way that Conrad, he talks about his great gift being the conversion of reality into impressions, right? Which are imminently subjectivized in a way, right? So again, like on one hand, of course, you can see this, and it's often been thought that this is a kind of like modernism is just kind of apolitical in that way, right? But the conversion to impressions or the sort of conversion to images that someone like Pound was talking about, right? It also has a political dimension in terms of how it relates, for example, to an attempt to devise strategies of representation that can keep pace with larger changes which are happening within capitalism itself. Um, uh, yeah, and anyway, I think that's about all I wanted to say there.
Thank you.
But thank you very
Yeah.
much, and I hope
I
you guys
wanted
appreciate
to,
this.
it's hard for me to talk because I'm not trained in literary theory. It's hard for me to talk about this stuff. So I didn't want to get to Conrad until like I focus on Conrad more. But thank you for making these introductions to it because I do think that part of also this shift to modernism has something to do with Jameson's theorization regarding how reification becomes kind of rendered inevitable, right? Because you see, I felt that in these 19th century figures, right, from the 1830s of the July Revolution, and of course, we would be remiss if we didn't pinpoint Adorno's beautiful reflection of Balzac's response to 1848, where Balzac is like, everyone must return to their desks and get back to work. Reality is much more interesting than anything that may be changing in it right now. That is so interesting, which is that like, no, 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 the revolution is here, and I wish to remain the kind of omniscient storyteller of it, right? And so it becomes this interesting reflection again, almost like a narcissistic point, which I think Adorno criticizes Freud in his creative daydreaming essay for creating what he calls a utilitarian theory of the novelist, in which the novelist is basically thought in this transitive way to social structure, in which their libidinal desire just is constantly enwrapped in it and you can't get beyond it, right? I think Jameson is saying something close to that in a certain way, but he's able to incorporate a theory of the symbolic because, again, melodrama remains at the Lacanian imaginary. Melodrama effectively would be um, like a dime a dozen, like a dime store, a cheap and popular version versus a higher version in which social commentary is possible and therefore something libidinally transformative is possible at a collective level. In other words, where the familial Oedipal dynamic can now be transposed and then transformed through the shared act of overcoming an ideology. And it seems to me like that's the revolutionary gesture of literary criticism, but it also seems to me that this is like what is rendered impossible or its representation is inevitably going to hit what Jameson calls the political unconscious, right? So in a certain sense, the utopian dimension is in abeyance in realism here, it seems. I mean, it's no.
Well, the issue is what
Go ahead.
oh, sorry.
Hmm.
Oh, the issue I think with respect to modernism, the issue gets at the point you made earlier that Jameson says that that this emphasis on the subject will always be a resistance to commodification,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? But then you also have again precisely an aestheticizing impulse that produces a world for commodification. So
Right.
it's the tension between those 2 points, right? In
Right.
other words, like the resistance of commodification on subjectivized or aesthetic grounds. And that would be quite germane to something like what Lukács is exploring in The Destruction of Reason, right?
Well,
Because immersion and
also,
subjectivity becomes the escape.
you have this idea that Gissing is known as a naturalist. And that's important because naturalism is sort of like this metabolic, organic reflection of like social positionality, whereby um, a writer's libidinal wish fulfillments and desires are themselves capable of being like um, channeled through a class in a certain way or expressed. So it's kind of back to this notion of expressive causality, right? Which Jameson never wants to fully extinguish or let go of, because
Mhm.
Balzac is expressive causality, but at like at a mastery level.
Mhm.
At the conclusion of Balzac's work, I think gives us um, no grand historical progress in which the contradictions of the social order resolve themselves. But he gives you these ways to sort of
Mhm.
inhabit like this kind of partial totality, right? These kind of like momentary glimpses of it, you know? But there's nothing like the full libidinal transfiguration. You know, you don't get that. It would be interesting to see how realism relates to libidinal transfiguration. Matilda, please jump in.
Uh, Thanks for y'all's comments so far. Um, I'm just thinking about, I guess, like Lukács poses the question very differently. It seems like for him, there's kind of like romanticism or expressionism, as he calls it, versus realism, and like like you were saying, it seems like realism for Lukács is about mediation or mediacy as opposed to immediacy. Whereas like expressionists are like are romantic in the way like Hegel criticizes that they like don't go step by step and kind of like hop. It's like a kind of an intuitive thing, and they're not able to like map out the social totality because they're like have some sort of irrationality that doesn't allow for like the construction of like a system of social totality or something. And I think like that mediation, I think, is called expressive totality, and in this book and in Althusser and stuff. But I feel like the tricky thing that Jameson does with Lukatch and the Balzac essay, where he says that Lukatch was right for the wrong reasons. I mean, it's kind of fascinating, like how absent really Lukatch is throughout this. He's right, but for the wrong reasons. So he's brought in at the end and kind of restored, but he's not really used in the process.
Right.
And I think half of that is the reason is that desire is so important for psychoanalysis, and desire are so important for Jameson. And I had a thought while you were speaking about why Balzac evokes the social totality, whereas, and you know, some people might call it realism, but maybe that's not so accurate according to Jameson. Is that like something's foreclosed as capitalism like develops and reification takes hold of people, and people's desires become private desires, and kind of that bourgeois subject of like exchange becomes solidified throughout society. And by like the time of Gissing, you have this kind of this closing happening, and that point about Ressentiment and Gissing, where like basically like there's no point in desiring anymore because just like there's something so apathy inducing about the whole situation or something. Whereas in Balzac, for one, desire seems still possible, and desire is what calls up the real, and the real is that social totality. And so because reification hasn't taken hold so strongly in Balzac's time, there is still desire happening. And desire, I mean, as you read through the Balzac essay, like desire is like that, or I'm sorry, the real is like called up by desire. It's like that against which like the fantasy kind of like tests itself against. Whereas that process just kind of stops happening later on. And
Yeah.
another aspect of this is, and I don't know exactly how it connects, but in Balzac, the desires are antagonistic objects of desire, whereas in the more reified world, they're private objects of desire. Also, a contrast that he explores, which I don't necessarily know what to make of it, is that there were more strategies in the time of Balzac, where he calls it modalities, I think, where by the time of Gissing and the time of reification, there's like the film, the point of view, the film vision. He calls it like the indicative mode is like, some people might say, oh, that's realism. It's purely indicative. The point of view, the concrete descriptions of things. But I mean, Jameson says things like, that's like taking leave of the outer world, is like
Yeah.
evoking things in deep concrete detail. And he says in Balzac's time, there's like, just like there's so many ways to write a sentence in like the imperative, the optative, the indicative, anyway, there's one that like Balzac is using throughout his novel that is also a contrast between the earlier and latter day. I think that's all I have for now.
That's really helpful. Part of this is so interesting because the whole locus of our conversation on these two chapters, before we get to Conrad and Lord Jim and romance and reification, is this idea of the binary opposition between two necessaries that clash and that produce what Jameson calls a this or a that. This is actually what she says, this is where Grey Moss helps us in the Balzacian universe, because in the Balzacian universe, the characters, we can they are representable as class to a class on the one hand, which then becomes incoherent or non-classifiable as capitalism advances. Yeah. So something like the palpable legibility of class conflict is more capable of having a sort of classical logical determination derived from those dramas and those conflicts. And in that sense, this is why if you read just the introduction to Lukatch's studies on European realism, you'll see that he makes, and of course the leftists and the liberals will criticize him for it, but I don't think he should be criticized. He makes a strong claim is that, Emile Zola, Stendhal, Balzac, these figures helped the proletariat to discover its own Weltanschauung, precisely because they revealed, on the one hand, the decadent deterioration of the class system of bourgeoisie and ancien regime, what was left of aristocracy, but also the expression of the characters allowed for a greater linkage between the individual and the expression of the individual's actions in line with class interest. I found that to be very interesting. That, in other words, realism gives us the means as socialists to organize a more coherent idea of the working classes worldview, which we know from these authors as well is experiencing deprivation, is experiencing reification, is experiencing fragmentation, right? So I find it very interesting that the lessons that is derived from reading Balzac for Lukatch are unabashedly applied to socialism, right? It doesn't, in that sense, it doesn't quite matter. The biographical doesn't matter. The unconscious wish fulfillment doesn't matter. Those local, familial, libidinal contradictions don't matter for Lukatch. And so I felt like I was sort of not really clear, or not, I guess I was clear, but I'm not sure. I think that Jameson has a bit of ambivalence about Lukatch's realism in this. if we're honest. Andrew, and thank you, Matilda. That was brilliant. You raised a bunch of stuff, so much that we neglected. Thank you so much.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Thank you, Daniel and Conrad, for the wonderful presentation. It was really helpful. Again, when you two speak together, it's like the Raekwon Ghostface Cuban Links album. So, um, two things that I'm stuck on is like one on page 67 when he focuses on Balzac's work, and he puts the Grey Moss Square upon like the four quadrants of like ancien regime as organic, and then it's like it's sort of like contrary as energy, which is Napoleon, and then you have culture as the sort of negation of energy. It's not, and then bourgeois is the nod of ancien regime. And it's interesting how like I guess like for Frederick Jameson, he's like pointing out like this is what we could see embedded in Balzac's work. And he says that it's both like a contradiction, but also a stark antinomy, an insoluble logical paradox, the historical pensée sauvage of the political unconscious. And then he goes on to just like talk about this, but I guess like of the political unconscious, in a sense, is like, is this what is like being sort of, is this what like for Frederick Jameson, is he sort of trying to attempt to historicize and point out in Balzac's realism, like this is what is at stake, even though he's an apologist for the ancien regime, he's pointing out something contradictory within Napoleon and sort of like, you know, the aftermath of the French Revolution in contradistinction between bourgeois, you know, sentiments and the culture related to, I guess you could say, Napoleon or what the bourgeois attempt. So like, I guess like I'm just trying to say like, what is it exactly that is produced from mapping on Balzac's sentiments of ancien regime, Napoleon, and the bourgeois from the novel via the Grey Moss Square. The last thing I want to kind of touch on that you pointed out, Daniel, was this notion that he mentions on 205 of Ressentiment among the human passions, the most deeply driven by bad faith of the Sartrean type, as authentic. And is that authentic because of like his alignment with Sartre insofar as that like it's authentic in the sense that, you know, for Sartre, the human enterprise is but an enterprise for freedom, and there's like a sort of stifling in human freedom? Or is it something more along the lines of the dialectical reason text where he's thinking of like a more collective work in which we work through collectively and totalize like an enterprise for freedom in the sort of Hegelian Marxian sense? And Ressentiment kind of lays that like the sort of thing that keeps us from having a pact with one another.
I think it's a negative point that ressentiment is the negative condition for any possible discovery of a break from bad faith, on the one hand, but also that it is that inescapable commodification of desires affecting all positions alike. And that, I think, then, as we were saying, kind of constitutes something like a rupture from the expressive modes, where these class positions had much more sort of, on the one hand, sort of idiosyncratic expressions of particular desires that were sort of locatable in like the movement of history. So, but as it pertains to 166, 167, this Grey Mossian point, I think it's helpful to point out the relationship that he draws between contradiction and antinomy, and the way that, in a sense, I mean, all he's really trying to show is the point of the impossibility of any of the characters to actually inhabit something like the totality itself. Or you could put it another way, whereby like this creates the conditions for the impossibility of like traditional romantic heroism to emerge, and so on, which is why all of the heroes, to the extent that they are going to fall through the cracks of the class system. They're not going to be easily represented in the dominant class positions, right? They're going to be like the criminals, the thieves, the outcasts, the outsiders, etc. Because within this sort of standard arrangement, this antinomy overrides the direction and hollows out the values, creates a crisis, I would say, of like a decadence in a certain way. So to me, I think the outcome of that is pretty straightforward. Are you confused? On what basis are you confused regarding it? Regarding 167?
You're
Oh,
on
I'm
mute.
muted.
No, I guess you answered it because like my sort of confusion was like, what was the intent of mapping out like those four positions on the gray moss square to be able to like to see like what is the result that Frederick Jameson is trying to do for mapping out Balzac and the emphasis of Balzac's realism, while also pointing out like that he is a sort of apologist for the ancien regime, but at the same time we have like these different like quadrants for all the different characters that represent different ideologies, for lack of a better term. But as you said, it's like more of like an impossibility. But then it makes me think it's like, oh, he's able to do that.
But what it also refers to is this notion of this claim that he makes, which is that why Balzac is a kind of early budding modernist, is that he portrays the decentered subject.
That's right. Yeah.
But the effect of this antinomy creates a contradiction in which subjectivity will inevitably have a decentered effect, right? So on the one hand, but then that also then has to be rerouted back into Balzac's own familial text, right? So the social text and the familial text are combined in this thing of what in all through science is called the imaginary, right? So you can begin to map in somewhat vulgar Lacanian things, which I tried to portray, the RSI onto this whole operation. The social, I think, is what's represented on 167, a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
The antinomy between the two seems, what is it? Energy and impotence. What is it again?
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
ancien regime, energy, impotence,
Yeah.
culture.
Yeah. Which makes sense because, in a sense, Balzac is submitting to a general Marxist notion of a two-class theory that moves history. That those were the two classes engaged in the French Revolution in a certain way. And now they've effectively reached a type of stalemate, right? But then from the position of the desire of the author, he desires that stalemate to persist. As I referenced vis-a-vis his position on 1848. He actually doesn't want the success of the workers. What he wants is the success of ancien regime.
Mm-hmm.
But he recognizes it's not possible, right? So that's kind of like that. It's that layering which I think is compelling. Obviously, the inclusion of the familial, the unconscious, libidinal, is nowhere in Lukatch. In fact, I think I'll send, or I didn't put it on Discord, but did I put it on Discord? Lukatch's essay on Freud.
I don't think so. No.
I'll put it on there because he does, I think, read a Freudian text. I forget which one, and he sort of chastises it as itself an expression of bourgeois, like it's like a bourgeois science that doesn't see itself as a bourgeois science or is not honest about the fact that it's a bourgeois science. I'm not saying that we should be convinced of Lukatch's criticism of psychoanalysis. Trust me. That would be a major contradiction if I believed that. No, of course, I think we must tether with both. But I just find it interesting, and I think it's quite powerful to add this. But I guess the other thing on bad faith, right, which is that one can escape bad faith for Sartre in a way which is like formulaic almost. Like it's like you can there's it's like one of the great things about teaching being and nothingness is like, here's the problem, here's the solution, and like you can practice it, and it's like a practice. It's a way of being in the world, And so I think when he says authentic ressentiment, he's not saying that Gissing is offering anything like a way out of it. I think he's just saying this is the sort of social condition that the characters are submitted to. But I don't know if others have takes on this. Please jump in.
I just wanted to add, just in terms of what you were saying about about Balzac and the Black Sheep, and this historical contradiction. I mean, I think that one of the things that France had to deal with, in the aftermath of Napoleon, and it became particularly clear as the 19th century went on, culminating probably in the Franco-Prussian War, was that France wasn't going to be able to play this decisive world historical role that it sought, in terms of creating a new dispensation. So it was thoroughly eclipsed by the developments of industrial capitalism and ultimately assimilated to them. And it's really interesting, right? Because if you look at the work of a lot of French socialist writers, of course, we can go back to utopian socialism. While it's mixed in terms of what people are saying, one consistent kind of refrain you find within it is the need to kind of overturn, the sort of structure of industrial capitalism as it had been advanced by Great Britain in particular, right? So suffice it to say that that vision doesn't really work out. But it is also important to understand, and to understand as well, that in many respects, while it's different and while it took a Republican form, the position that France assumed in the 19th century, vis-a-vis, the English-speaking world and Great Britain in particular, was in many respects an anticipation of the position taken by socialist states in the 20th century, right? Or even one could argue, in some sense, the kind of position taken today by China in relation to the United States. And of course, we know that Marx says at some point that we'll go to the Great Wall of China and we'll see liberté, égalité, fraternité inscribed on it one day, right? But I think with respect to this story, so you have this immersion, in capitalism and the relinquishing of these lofty goals. But I also think that you have something else going on, which is after the Franco-Prussian War in particular, France begins to invest heavily in cultural capital, because it was clear that it was kind of vanquished militarily, even within Europe, right, by the ascendant German states. And this is actually where French philosophy begins to, obviously, we can talk about people who are very important, Descartes, Voltaire and Rousseau and so forth, but where France becomes more of a specialized philosophical economy, and it relates to the promotion of soft power as it was developed in this period. So in this book, right, where ultimately, Philippe, who is this officer in the Napoleonic Wars who resigns out of loyalty to him, and then there's this fight over inheritance, and then at the end he goes to Algeria and dies. And of all people, right, Joseph, the painter, right, sort of ironically ends up inheriting the fortune. Of course, he's also allegorizing the situation of France in that time, where kind of a member of, through this symbolic loss experienced by someone who is this kind of proud Napoleonic fighter, right? And the way that it's going to be this kind of artist who people had previously thought would be unfit for this role. And it's interesting also his death in Algeria, the death by Philippe, because one could argue that even before the French colonial empire had reached its apex, one can sense within Balzac's work a premonition of the eventual failure of French colonialism, right? And its integration into, a putatively non-colonial kind of capitalist world structure. So there's some very interesting things going in there, but I just wanted to reflect a little bit on the conditions around that.
One thing on this notion of familial text that I'm surprised Jameson didn't mention is what Sartre spends a lot of time in the Flaubert biography, which is that Sartre makes this really bold claim that he thinks that Flaubert's epileptic seizure was willed as a revolt against his bourgeois father's pressure to make him be a medical doctor. And that, in other words, it was similar to the Stendhalian point about the leisure of the artist, which was being prevented by his father's pressure. And moreover, for Flaubert, very interesting, because the desire takes on a reactionary hue in a very direct way in relationship to the Paris Commune in particular. And Sartre says that Flaubert practiced Black humanism after the Commune, which he defines as a humanism which is cognizant but also disavowing of the total decadent failure of the bourgeois class project. So in other words, Flaubert remains in the fantasy of an ascendant bourgeois culture and writes from this position because he's terrified of proletarian revolution. Whereas Balzac seems to be a figure um, who doesn't hold any trust that a proletarian revolution will ever occur. It's kind of like similar to the way that Lukatch and Loserdo read Nietzsche. They read Nietzsche as paranoid over proletarian success. So the desire of Nietzsche is driven from that paranoia that the world would that his class would lose its stability, which is of course why otium and leisure is such a central motif in Nietzsche's thought, right? So I found that a bit kind of pertinent because again, if we're going to take the familial text and biography so seriously, we should go all the way. And I think that maybe we don't know enough about Balzac's biography. I certainly haven't cited enough to draw like exactly the types of conclusions about it. But Matilda, please jump in.
Yeah, I'm interested. I mean, I felt like the Grammatian Square was like successful in this this application, and I'm curious if we'll see it again. I honestly can't remember when I saw it last. This totally fleshed out. But I mean, there's just so much in this one chapter. It's insane. I feel like Jameson's just a very rich writer. That it starts with this question about the end of storytelling and about how all of the like how the novel is this mechanism, it's the end of genre, and it's this mechanism by which like bourgeois society kind of processes all of these older structures in order to like construct a new referent out of it. And so I think like what's going on here in the Grammatian Square is like Balzac kind of sitting at this point in time where there's all of these possibilities that are his political unconscious is just kind of like operating, and he has this and desire and its object is still public rather than private. And so like I think what's counterintuitive about Jameson's reading is that like Balzac is like a utopian writer because the utopian impulse is still a public one, or it's not privatized at this point through reification, which Lukatch would probably be very disappointed with that sort of opinion. But like basically like this chapter is called like the problem of the subject, and the whole question of character is here. And like in the Balzac novel, which almost doesn't, when you say the word novel, you don't really think about like Balzac's novel style. It's like one of the points here is that there's no main character really. And so there's like there's Madame Cormon's house, who two characters in this provincial town are fighting over, the aristocrat and the bourgeois guy. And then like Jameson does this interesting operation where he also in the Grammatian Square is doing psychoanalysis by like, there are indications, I mean, in the story of like potency and impotency, but like there's this whole biographical operation that's happening in order to construct this. Two other points that maybe haven't been touched on in the square is that, and this is all like the political unconscious, I suppose, just being mapped as it's operating to find a solution in order to attain the utopian object of desire. The terms that combine at the top are he calls them the complex term, and that represents a character who just shows up at the end, who Madame Cormon thinks is the perfect solution of the person to marry, because she is trying to figure out who to marry, and whoever marries gets her house or whatever. And this guy comes along who's like the perfect person, but like it's just not a viable option. He's already married, and like he kind of disappears from the scene. And then the neuter term at the bottom, which is fascinating that it actually, the neutral term at the bottom represents Athenais, who's this fourth suitor character who is this young gentleman who's not rich by any means, but he has extreme talent. And this represents Balzac in this story as like the writer with talent or whatever. And Athenais wants to marry Madame Cormon because his talent will go to waste without money. And so he needs like leisure time in order to like produce his, he commits suicide. And so like the complex term and the neutral term are both like, they don't work, but they're fascinating. Jameson makes a remark about the neutral term at the bottom is between bourgeois society that's like energetic but sterile. You know, you just think of like the reification process. And then on the other hand, it's a combination of culture, which is like kind of languid or whatever. But he says that that neutral term represents romanticism. And so, in a sense, you're getting, perhaps by observing in the story and Balzac's political unconscious at work, you're seeing like a prefiguration of what will become a dominant mode for as a solution to the problem is like the bourgeois society is sterile, it can't have culture, those things are kind of incompatible, and romanticism is like a mode that like somehow creates this false solution for the problem of like culture and bourgeois society. I just wanted to add those things as well.
Yeah, thank you for walking us through 167. I think that will help Andrew's questioning regarding the presentation of that Grammatian square. That was excellent. I was myself, I'm still unclear about the function of the neutral term and how it is understood in a kind of schematic way in any Grammatian square. How is that derived? Although, I mean, we're getting better after Connor's presentation last time. I feel like I'm a bit more comfortable. I'm not quite there yet where I can like look at a text and just like come up with it. Because I also think one of the hard things about it is to sort of the determination of what constitutes a valid or like a primary seam, right? To me, that seems challenging. In other words, what is the procedure by which we've reduced social conflict to an antinomy? That's actually not easy to do if you think about it, especially when we get to like modernist period. So I don't know. Charles, please.
So yeah, and in your early breakdown, you talked about Jameson being on about wanting to get on a combination of the imaginary and the symbolic, and then also the comment that the political unconscious is a intersection of the imaginary and the real. And I'm trying to get at it seems like page 224 in the reading, I guess it's the reading for today, where he talks about trying to understand how Conrad overleaps the Jamesian moment. It seems like a pretty pregnant page where he talks about he says from the perspective of language, the self-generation of the text translates itself as the boiling emergence and disappearance of so many transitory centers, now no longer points of view so much as sources of language. Like trying to make this turn where he talks about he says it's something that changes everything. They are point of view conceived as being inseparable from speech, from the materiality of language. And then he calls this the appearance of the symbolic in its widest sense, over and against, which the symbolic in its widest sense, which would be the sheerest repudiation of just such notions of consciousness and psychology. And I guess I'm wondering here in terms of this page here, would the imaginary correspond to consciousness and psychology, or is it symbolic? Is a leap beyond that to some degree in terms of what you were talking about, the necessity of distinguishing the two? Does that make any sense to ask?
No,
This
it's a good point. It's a good point. I wanted to table the Conrad discussion and romance and reification to next week so we can have a more focused point on, just because I felt that and I should have indicated this, I felt that the conversation on Balzac and Gissing is a lot itself. So if we add a third, it's over the top. But I think what he's referring to here, you can find reference in this book here by Mikhail Bakhtin, The Dialogical Imagination. It's very interesting work where we'll get a better idea of the way that characters express a kind of general form of speech, which can be linguistically isolated as in concert with the class speech. So it's kind of like as far as I understand it, the singularity of these expressive characters that we deal with in 19th century realism, a la Balzac, now becomes funneled through something far more symbolically rote and typified and therefore analyzable through this distinction of long and parole that Bakhtin works with. And this is where we can then perform a linguistic and semantic analysis on texts purely from the use of language itself. And so what ends up happening is that the original interiority of the characters gets dissolved into the way that they become stand-ins for social class. So you see, class doesn't disappear. It just mutates in such a way that the individual no longer has the same agency that they did, where they were like in the Balzacian universe, they're like an expressive representation of a class, right? And then conflict can be located across classes in this strong, clash of two necessaries, right? Resulting in like a comedy or resulting in like a tragedy and so on, right? Which again is like the Hegelian idea of tragedy. So I think what he's trying to say that in this modernist period, Saussure's structural linguistics becomes more useful as a means to analyze characters in relationship to class. But again, I think we should table that, if you don't mind, for next week, where we can really dig into it. But he's also saying, by the way, apropos my diagram, which was my diagram was the same one that you saw at the very end of Realism and Desire chapter, but I added a few things onto it. I added a few additional concepts. I'm happy to bring it back up. But what he's simply saying there is that melodrama, like popular romance, really just remains at the imaginary. It doesn't enter into the possibility to isolate actual social contradictions. That's what he calls like symbolic literature. And symbolic literature is like the high literature of realism, in which the writer can actually show how kind of like the imaginary is interacting with other imaginaries in a certain way. Connor, please.
Yeah, what's up, everybody? I just wanted to talk a little bit about like the end of the Ressentiment chapter, which is just a banger in itself as a chapter. But I just like the ending of it because this sort of persistence of like class emerging when it should have been contained. Part of what Jameson is talking about there is that like this is a problem, not only, to borrow a phrase from the chapter, of a crisis of totality that he borrows from Lukatch, but it's also a crisis in the novel in a more simple sense of just like it's not pleasurable reading material for the people that it's supposed to be satisfying. And so, this is something that Jameson likes to talk about elsewhere as well. Like how do we make like interesting literature that's like supposed to satisfy this function? And it's also interesting too because part of the drama of Gissing is just like providing kinds of satisfaction and making compelling characters that operate on an earlier ethical let's call it episteme of good versus evil, like that stuff is beginning to wane away. And so how then do you make dramatic and interesting stories and characters? That's a serious problem, right? And again, he likes to talk about this. It's interesting to think about that in our own current media. But yes, also, uh, Daniel was just talking about like how is it that we like begin to articulate this antinomies in regards to the squares. And it reminds me of something I was thinking about last week, which is really asking the same question. How do we know when we've like completed the first concentric level of analysis, right? And it's interesting. There's like certain like things that remain, let's call it like an object of interest for Jameson. And indeed, the three concentric levels. He's really interested in problems of scale, you know, like further expanding, or is our like view like too narrow and what have you. And so it seems as though with the three concentric levels, we're like constantly expanding, and indeed we are. But I think this question of scale is also operating on the first level. It's like that's sometimes hard to pick up, and I think that's indeed the contradiction that is being registered. Um, for those who are like not gamed up, like this book is very much the political unconscious, indebted to like Kenneth Burke, you know, who I feel like no one reads anymore. But this a lot of this is borrowed out of Burke. And so for example, uh Burke likes to talk about how it is that two competing discourses seem to be challenging one another on the level of like terms and in explaining phenomena. Uh, but Burke will go on to say that that conceals that the real competition and the irreconcilability of these competing discourses is true because of uh, irreconcilable scales of analysis. So you have positivism, for example, which is dealing with, you know, caught up in science, what's in front of you. Uh, and then on another level, you might have the familial, which is going to explain phenomena not from what's in front of you, but from history and a certain genetic and genesis sort of thing. So they're two irreconcilable epistemic views to explain phenomena, in that one is looking right in front of you, and the other is explaining phenomena from deriving from another source. And the problem then is in finding a common ground. And then when you can find a common ground, now we're arriving at the second level of analysis. So the first task would then be completed if we can register that contradiction in two competing, irreconcilable epistemic views in explaining phenomenon. And then the common ground would turn out to be for Jameson, it comes back to class, right? That would be the common ground. So I feel like I hope this makes sense, but for you know, going back to Kenneth Burke, I feel like not enough debt is paid to Kenneth Burke in explaining Jameson as a thinker. But yeah, that was just some things I've been thinking about.
Thank you. So you're suggesting that two dominant theoretical worldviews at a given moment in history can serve as the locus of how we split an initial antinomy and then portray it back in through whatever text cultural object that we want to portray it through. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah,
Because I mean, it would be useful in a certain way to perform a kind of historicism of moments of historical conflict in which we then are capable of superimposing primary antinomies that drive those the contradictions that inhabit those historical moments. Right? Like one could get quite fancy and quite elaborate in doing so. I feel like I want to call up Gabriel Tupanamba, who probably would like spend hours with us just like doing that. I also wanted to raise this question about Ressentiment and the division of labor, linking it back to our studies on division of labor and ideology in Lo Cerdo. where Loserdo makes an argument, I think, pretty nicely that internal to like a species and genus, right, of class struggle, that one of the manifestations of class struggle is a sort of necessity for us to account for a kind of inevitability of conflict vis-a-vis the unstable status of the division of labor. In other words, you remember his point that he makes in Class Struggles, that even within bourgeoisie, there exists this kind of like a war over the division of labor, which takes on an ideological valence, which Lukatch also talks about a lot, especially when you get to imperialism, because in imperialism, social Darwinism, biologism, and naturalist appeals to a conception of society become necessary as a protective measure for conquering the otherwise unruly division of labor, i.e., ressentiment. So if the social metabolic system is racked by ressentiment, that means that every subject position in it, irrespective of class, is sort of like experiencing great turbulence vis-a-vis the division of labor itself. And like nothing is fixed, no one is happy, etc., which kind of goes to the notion of authentic ressentiment, because it's like that creates the negative conditions of something universal that we share, a point of solidarity that we share insofar as we want to resist it, which is actually pretty cool. Like if that's the conclusion of Gissing, that's actually a very great reading, I think, Anyways, we've probably closed soon. Are there other thoughts, folks that haven't jumped in? That I've really enjoyed. I mean, I'm so happy we chose this book. It's been so challenging to me, though. The reading. This is not my area of specialty at all, and thanks for the challenge on this, guys. It's been a lot. And I'll post the video from last week tomorrow morning. By the way, get the Tarantino action. I've been thinking about that a lot. By the way, I went and started to read some of these books on the Mansons. Got me on the whole rabbit hole. Especially after like Brian Wilson died and that like whole California thing, and like how weird it is because they're all like welfare state luxury, but like extremely unhappy at the same time. I don't get it. Um, Dennis was chilling. Dennis?
Dennis Wilson, that is Brian's. You
Oh,
weren't
I
aware of
didn't
that?
know that.
Oh
Wait,
yeah. Very famously,
really?
Dennis Wilson was like pals with Charles in the family. It's like for
Oh
quite a
shit.
bit.
Oh
Yeah.
God. All of these weird connections. Yeah. Yeah. Conrad, you missed our conversation on Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Did I tell you that Ellie's gonna be at the same prison that one of the Manson family members is gonna be at? So she's gonna be working with them in the psychology unit. So it's gonna be pretty rad.
Actually,
Probably get to interact with them.
I have a big I have a big issue with this movie and the way that it the way that it uses the Manson family, who are almost all presented as female, as a kind of like, cipher for like this unreasonable social progressivism, which has to be fought off by these like, sort of glamorized male Hollywood actors. I mean, it's not, it's really a film about, kind of the suffering of like the oppressed overachiever, right? And I feel like the class implications are like quite dubious when you get into it.
It's a commentary on Me Too, right? In a certain way.
Oh, yeah, I mean, yeah, and I mean, like when you dig into that, like people were surprisingly maybe uncritical of that, because when you dig into it, of course, it was Weinstein and Miramax that were so instrumental to the early success of Tarantino. So there's
Mm.
a tremendous there's it seems to me to be a very, very very strong attack on some of and I'm not trying to uncritically defend those same social currents, but it just strikes me as very elitist in nature.
Hmm. Excellent. All right. Well, happy reading, comrades. And we'll have two more sessions. So let's just review this. So next week, we will talk about all of Romance and Reification. And let's try our best to get to 280. It's a lot, but I think it's doable. And we'll just talk about that next week. And then we'll have a light day, our final day on July 1st, and just sort of talk about utopian ideology. And maybe people can, you know, present, or people that haven't spoken can jump in more. We'll just sort of have a more celebratory. But next week we'll just do a full Conrad romance and reification. Sound like a plan? Excellent. Conrad, thank you to you, Conrad, not the author,
I
for
have this weird like interpolation moment when anyone talks about
as you should. Yeah, no, this is such a joy. Thanks for doing this, guys. And until we meet again. Peace out.